Welcome here, I'm Dr. Andrew Coates, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about Theodor Adorno, who is a very influential film theorist, offers, I think, a really important critical perspective on movies, and this is, I think, a really important place to start our conversations about religion and film. So today I want to give you some background and a little bit of context about Theodor Adorno and his life to help you make sense of this essay, The Culture Industry, on which Adorno is the lead author. And this is really a classic work in the field of film studies and cultural studies and Marxist studies. It's a whole bunch of different academic disciplines that use this essay. And it was written back in 1944, but I still think it has a lot to teach us today. And in fact, maybe in today's media landscape, it's probably more relevant than it's been for a really long time. Adorno, I think, offers a really useful place for starting to think differently about religion and film. And that's really just my main goal in this video and beyond. I want to help you think differently about religion and film. And to do that today, I want to help you guide you through Adorno's ways of thinking critically about film. And hopefully he can help us think a little bit differently about the relationships between religion and film. So that being said, I want to begin by acknowledging just how hard this essay is to read. I recognize that it just is a tough thing to read. I've been reading this essay since I was an undergraduate student many years ago, and I still have trouble following every twist and turn of Adorno's thinking. So that's my way of saying, don't feel bad if you have trouble understanding this essay the first time you read it. Especially with dense theoretical text like this, I think the best approach is really just to plow forward. Struggle with it, read it as closely as you can, read it very slowly. If possible, read it at least twice if you have the time. And as you're going through, try to find memorable lines or phrases, or maybe even just a line or phrase that gets repeated, and then try to figure out what Adorno means by that phrase or by that line. I think the usefulness of this essay in particular comes from thinking along with it and going slowly back to it again and again to consider the different ways that Adorno is approaching the problem of what film is and why it is the way it is. If nothing else, I hope you'll get an appreciation for the way that Adorno thinks, and even if you ultimately disagree with specific claims that he's making, and I, to be fair, certainly disagree with a lot of things he's saying in this essay. But nonetheless, I think Adorno has a really interesting way of thinking about film, and we can become better analysts of film if we can learn to think critically along with him. One of the things I really value about this essay, The Culture Industry, is that it showcases just how relentless of a critical thinker Adorno was. Really, whenever we start to get comfortable with the movies we're watching, or if we're just passively enjoying watching a movie, Adorno would be most enraged at that moment. He wants us to wake up and pay attention, especially when we're not paying attention. And he wants us to think critically and hard about what movies are actually doing with us, for us, and to us in our society. Because basically, as far as Adorno is concerned, there's almost nothing redeeming about movies. There's nothing really good about them. He thinks movies manipulate us, particularly if we're just sitting back and enjoying them uncritically. And he wants us never to be comfortable when we're watching movies. He wants us instead to pay critical, careful, ruthless attention to what movies are actually doing to us. And that kind of sharp, critical perspective, I think, is really helpful if we're going to start thinking more critically about religion and film. So, in cartoons, when a character faces a moral dilemma, and they usually end up with a little angel sitting on one shoulder and a little devil sitting on the other shoulder, and the angel whispers in their ear that they should be good, and the devil whispers in their ear that they should be bad. it's my hope that whenever you watch a movie now for the rest of your life, after you've watched this video and thought a little bit about Adorno, that hopefully you'll have a little Adorno sitting on your shoulder, whispering into your ear all the time that you should think critically, you should question what's being presented to you in movies, and you should really think about what movies are doing in our society, and think about the ways that our apparently dumb, fun cultural products actually maybe demonstrate much deeper and more disturbing things about our society than we might want to acknowledge. I think one of Adorno's greatest ideas in this essay, The Culture Industry, is that we can't just allow ourselves to remain uncritical viewers who passively consume movies like so many buckets of popcorn. And I think that's interesting tactic to take because so many of us probably start our journey with movies that way. We like movies, maybe we even love some movies, and that's not necessarily a bad thing as far as I'm concerned, but Adorno would be deeply concerned by that. He wants us to think long and hard about why we like movies, why we allow them to do what they do to us, and he wants us to think really critically about how movies reflect the real world that we actually live in. And I think if you can move past the struggle of just like his language and how weird and hard this essay is to read, Adorno actually presents a really powerful way of thinking critically about the work that films do in our cultures, in our societies, and in our lives. And frankly, for him, it's just like, it's a really bleak view. Movies he doesn't think are just fun and enjoyable. He thinks they manipulate us in ways we don't even realize. I want to spend just a few minutes talking briefly about Adorno's life history and some of his most important ideas, and hopefully this will help you get a stronger sense of why Adorno is so critical toward film in this essay, The Culture Industry, and why ultimately I think his way of thinking is still very valuable to consider. Just a brief life sketch of Adorno. He's born in Germany in 1903. His mother was a German Lutheran. His father, however, came from a family that at the time was described as assimilated German and Jewish. So that is to say, Adorno's father came from a Jewish ethnic background, but he basically thought of himself as culturally German rather than primarily as culturally Jewish. And in fact, Adorno's father so desperately wanted to be fully accepted into German society at the time that he got baptized as a Lutheran Christian as an adult. And, you know, people's reasons for doing that in the early 20th century, late 19th century Germany are very complex, and I don't think we should attribute any like specific way of thinking to Adorno's father. But I can say that one possible reason why someone would do this, other than like sincere religious conviction, is that in German society at that time, only baptized Christians could fully participate in society. So, for example, only Christians could send their kids to university or get certain jobs in the government. And so Adorno's father seems to have converted to Christianity, at least on paper, so that his family could fully participate in German society. He really, the family was mostly concerned about being German and fitting in with other people in their sort of upper middle class, wealthy social status. And so to do that, at least on paper, Adorno's father converted to Christianity. Okay, back to the life story. I mean, so young Adorno was basically a child prodigy on the piano. He was really amazing as a concert pianist. He completed his PhD in music at the absurdly young age of 21, which even back then was really impressive, really amazing. No one really is able to do that today. It would be basically a freak of nature who's able to complete a PhD in music at the age of 21. So Adorno was one of these people, and growing up, Adorno really seemed poised to kind of join the ranks of the great German classical music tradition. People really expected him to be something like the next Bach or the next Beethoven. They really thought this kid was super talented and probably had a great future ahead of him in the German musical tradition. But then, unfortunately, for those who wanted him to become like a musical genius leader of the world, whatever, as he did his post-PhD studies, Adorno started reading Karl Marx. And he became less and less interested in music for music's sake and became more and more interested in music as an aspect of culture that needed serious Marxist analysis and critique. So, along with his collaborator Max Horkheimer and some other colleagues, including Walter Benjamin, who I'll talk about in a later video, Adorno became a founding member of something called the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. And today, most people just call this group of scholars working at the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt around this time. We call them the Frankfurt School for short. And that's because the Frankfurt School invented a new way of thinking to describe what they were doing academically, and they used new terms and new descriptors for their academic project. And their goal really was to develop what they called critical theory. They wanted to develop new ways of thinking critically about every aspect of society. And so Adorno focused his attention specifically on developing new understandings of culture. And he wanted to apply a Marxist lens to think about the products of his own culture and of capitalist cultures more broadly. So the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, along with Adorno, were all heavily influenced by Karl Marx's thinking about economics and society. And I'm sure some of you have heard of Marx before, but just so we're all on the same page, Marx was a very strong critic of capitalism. He thought the economic system of capitalism was fundamentally unjust and unequal. According to Marx, capitalism is exploitative by its very nature. It alienates people from the true value of the things they make, and even from the true value of their own work. Marx thought that working people under capitalist economies are basically held hostage by the capitalist system. Even though it's the thing oppressing them, people just sort of become okay with it, and we become all right with our oppression under capitalism. So for Marx, capitalism makes people complacent with unjust, unfair, unequal social arrangements, and it makes the people who live under it accept a world in which very few people at the top of society make tons and tons of money, and most people at the bottom of society have almost no money. Capitalism just makes us accept that social arrangement as if it's true or natural or necessary. And likewise, capitalism makes people accept a society where human lives really don't have much value other than what they contribute to the economy, right? In the most brutal capitalist accounting, we have no value to society except what we can produce economically. And Marx thought that was a problem. I mean, he looked at capitalism from basically every angle, and he found nothing good to say about it. And he really made it his life's mission to try to convince people that other economic arrangements were possible, and some of them were maybe even more desirable to capitalism. Marx, of course, was also famously critical of religion. In one often quoted, and I think often really misunderstood passage, Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses, or the opiate of the people. And I could do a whole video just on that line from that one text in Marx, but in a nutshell, I think what he meant by this is that religion, like a powerful narcotic, only temporarily eased the pain created, as far as he was concerned, by capitalist society itself, right? So basically he thought religion made people feel better about the problems of poverty and its associated physical suffering, but it never got to the root of those problems and could never actually solve those problems. So for Marx, religion was basically just like putting a tiny band-aid on the gunshot wound caused by capitalism. And he thought religion really just made people forget what their real problems were without actually solving anything. So he wasn't exactly like anti-religion. He just thought that the way religion worked in his society was ultimately not going to solve anything for anybody, and that he thought people should spend their time thinking about and doing much more useful things than just being religious. So drawing on Marx, Adorno and the thinkers of the Frankfurt School also suggested that capitalism was a fundamentally unjust economic system. But unlike Marx, the thinkers of the Frankfurt School thought that the oppression in capitalist society most powerfully happened at the level of our consciousness. So in other words, they argued that under capitalism, our minds absorb these oppressive social and economic arrangements, and we come to think of them as natural or necessary or inevitable parts of all human societies. And the thinkers of the Frankfurt School thought that the best way to bring about change in society then, to create a better world, was to start by changing people's minds and to change their consciousness of the society that is oppressing them and help them basically wake up and stop just letting it happen. So Adorno and the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School began turning their attention away from just the strictly economic problems that Marx was most concerned about and started looking at the cultural products that are all around us all the time. And they began to think really critically about every aspect of our society and our culture. So they started to say that to understand how a culture really works, we shouldn't just study great works of music written by the likes of Beethoven. They said we should also study pop music, or the stupid songs we all sing as little kids and do actions to at school or at church or whatever. They said we shouldn't just study like Rembrandt paintings as great works of art, but we should study posters, advertisements, the pictures that we see in magazines and journals, the mass-produced kitschy crap that you find like on the walls of bus stops and hotels. All of that stuff, the thinkers of the Frankfurt School argued, could tell us about how capitalism duped people into accepting the unjust conditions of our society. So they really thought that by studying ordinary stuff, the things of our culture, that we might actually get a better window into what capitalism was doing and how it was creating this consciousness among people that told them everything's fine and everything is as good as it can possibly be, when they were, as far as they are concerned, things aren't fine. Things are not the best they can possibly be. We can do better as a society. So to get back to the life story of Adorno and start explaining why it matters a little bit, the timeline's really actually quite critical here. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Theodor Adorno was becoming one of the more famous champions of Marx in academic circles in his time. He was a strong critic of culture. He wanted to challenge the status quo. He wanted people to think differently about the world. And while he's thinking this stuff, while he's writing about this new Marxist perspective, I'll remind you, he's also living in Germany, and he comes from a Jewish background. And it's the beginning of the 20th century. And that is creating a host of problems for him because Hitler and the Nazi movement were on the rise at exactly this moment in history. So Adorno is trying to analyze culture, and at the same time, the culture around him is coalescing into something that he's going to ultimately find deeply, deeply horrifying. Adorno became deeply shocked and troubled at how quickly German intellectuals and artists, especially in the film industry, how quickly they caved to the Nazis and then actually actively started supporting the Nazi regime. By the mid-1930s, Germany was becoming a very dangerous place for Adorno, in part because of his Jewish heritage, in part because of his leftist politics, in part because of his academic status and his interest in Marx. So by 1938, Adorno sort of saw the writing on the wall, and he realized that he had to get out of Germany. So along with several other prominent German Jewish professors and intellectuals, most notably Albert Einstein, Adorno flees Germany, and he's granted refugee status in the United States. Ultimately, he came to settle in Los Angeles, where there was a large community of German refugees that had taken root. And just long story short, to pull it back to the things we're thinking about relating to religion and film, Adorno arrives in LA in the late 1930s and is basically horrified by what he saw happening. This was the so-called golden age of Hollywood movies, and movies were really the most popular ticket in town. The most popular form of music at the time was big band jazz. To a German professor with a PhD in music and a strong interest in Marx, who's a critic of capitalist culture, this discordant music and this Hollywood drivel was just simply horrendous, right? Adorno saw Americans consuming dumb, mass-produced crap instead of great art, and he thought that this was an indication that things were going to get bad very quickly in America. And so he really tried to develop ways of thinking that would put America on a different track than Germany had followed. Adorno basically became convinced that because of how American culture worked, America wasn't immune to fascism. And at the time, right, America was fighting a war against fascism. But Adorno thought that American culture had all the same tendencies that he had seen back in Germany. And in fact, he became convinced that America was just like a razor's edge away from flipping over into a fascist dictatorship like Germany. He became especially concerned about his adopted homeland's future. He didn't want to see America follow Germany's path. And so, at the height of the Second World War, he wrote The Culture Industry as a critique of American culture, as basically his own desperate attempt to keep America from going down the same dark and dangerous path that Germany had taken during his lifetime. So the heart of Adorno's essay, I think, really is in the title of the essay. For him, it is crucial to recognize that our culture is an industry. It's not a culture, it's an industry. And the sole purpose of this industry, like any other industry, is to make money. And that's a harsh thing to say. But basically what he's suggesting is, like, the movies we love, the stories we find so powerful and moving, the plots that we find so interesting, the characters we identify with so deeply, the movies that shape our personal identities and our relationships. Adorno wants us to recognize that these movies exist for the sole purpose of making money, and we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking it's anything else. These movies are not any more creative than they have to be to make money. They're not any more moving or powerful or emotionally resonant than they have to be to make money. And if we identify with a character in a movie and we feel like our struggle is being represented on the screen, it's probably because someone in a boardroom decided that that movie needed to appeal to people like you, and so the character needed to be cast a particular way, or say their lines a particular way, or wear a particular kind of costume, or be a specific age, or whatever. Nothing in a movie happens by accident, and Adorno wants us to recognize that, at minimum, our movies start from a place of profit. They exist to line the coffers of those that make them. And so Adorno draws attention to the powerful interests that shape culture around us. When products get created in our society, they aren't just made for creative purposes. They aren't created to offer a new perspective on something. They're made because powerful people with a strong interest in profiting off of the thing decided that this is what we needed to see. And Adorno reminds us that what we think of as being really different kinds of cultural products are ultimately not very different at all. They're all just about making money for people in positions of power, people like the CEO, the board of directors, and the stockholders of corporations. And so the cultural products that we think are really different from each other are not actually different at all, right? We might think that watching our favorite college basketball team is really different than watching a sci-fi movie like Star Wars, or that both of those are really different things than watching a trashy reality romance show or a nature documentary. But when we're watching all of these supposedly different things, Adorno suggests we're ultimately just lining the pockets of huge media corporations. And in fact, Adorno suggests that huge cultural producers like Disney or Fox or Paramount have a vested interest in providing us with these apparently limitless options for entertainment to feed all of our supposedly unique interests, because ultimately they have a vested interest in appealing to as many viewers as possible because it maximizes their profits. So for this reason, Adorno thinks that we should approach cultural products with like at least a little bit of skepticism and maybe even some concern. Because after all, if someone is trying to sell you something and you're aware of it, that's at least a very different arrangement than if someone is trying to sell you something and you're not even aware of it, right? Adorno basically is accusing the culture industry of behaving like those annoying street performers that insert themselves into a photograph you're taking and then charge you for the privilege of having taken their picture. In the end, Adorno suggests the culture industry only exists to profit off of us. And to make the maximum profit that it can off of us, it wants to shape us into these perfectly docile consumers, these mindless drones who don't even care that we're being sold something every minute of the day, as we're being sold something every minute of the day. The culture industry wants every single one of us to become blissfully unaware that the things we care most about, the things we think are expressions of our identity, the things, the products we love, the shows we watch, he wants us to recognize that all of these are actually just being created to keep us consuming. We think our tastes show who we are, but Adorno thinks we've got it backwards. Our tastes are carefully created and curated by corporate committees, and then products get made that cater to people like us, right? We think some shows and movies are just objectively better than ours, but really they're just the ones with slicker production values, better marketing budgets, or the ones that appeal to broader demographics than the corny romantic Christmas movies my mother loves, right? That's the point for Adorno. The culture industry is just going to keep endlessly churning out a supply of things for us to love, no matter who we are. And they know exactly who we are because they made us. And they make us think the ways we do about what it means to be a person in our society and what it means to have an identity. So for Adorno, that's the real danger. The products of our culture aren't created because someone had a good idea, because someone had a stroke of creativity, because someone wanted to change the world. They're not even created to make us think or to show us different sides of life. They're not even created so we can enjoy them. They are created to shape every single one of us into specific kinds of consumers whose needs are already being met by the culture industry. The point of the culture industry, Adorno suggests, is to shape us into perfectly docile, passive consumers who fit nicely into the different tranches of their business, right? Sports fans, superhero fans, reality TV fans, anime fans, gritty crime drama fans, Hallmark Christmas movie fans. The culture industry is trying to shape us into these kinds of people because it already has products that can meet our needs if we're those kinds of people. And the craziest, scariest thing of all for Adorno is that we love the culture industry for doing it to us. We become totally complicit in the monetization of our own values, our own interests, and our own identities. And we just lap it up. We love the culture industry for giving us this stuff. And according to Adorno, right, the hidden purpose of the culture industry is just to shape us into such good consumers that we can't possibly imagine our lives without the fabulous products that the culture industry has already produced for us. And they're so good at doing it, we don't realize that it's happening. We just keep watching, and ultimately we love them for doing it. That's a very scary, bleak view of what movies are actually all about. But for Adorno, that's it. Movies are about making us into mindless drones who will just keep watching movies. And I realize, yeah, this sounds really grim maybe, but think about it for a second. I mean, what is the actual purpose of something like Netflix or something like YouTube? Right? For Adorno, it's not to disrupt the film industry or to showcase creativity in new ways or to make innovative art or to offer challenging new ideas. It's to make products that are so appealing to you, no matter who you happen to be or what you happen to enjoy, that you'll just keep subscribing and you'll keep forking over a few dollars in ad revenue or subscription fees for the rest of your life. Right? These platforms exist simply to keep us watching them. And the less we think about that, the happier the culture industry will be with us. Adorno, for his part, really just wants us to wake up and realize that there might be more to life than what the culture industry is providing for us. So now to the real meat of it, I want to think a little bit about film and what Adorno says about film, because that, after all, is the main purpose here, to think about religion and film. Adorno considers film, I think, to be the quintessential example of how the culture industry works as a well-oiled machine, right? Let's face it, as he suggests, most movies really are pretty boring and pretty predictable. They're all basically the same, and that's by design, right? When we watch films, we don't have to think very critically. We can watch them while we're distracted. We don't really have to work our brains to understand films. They just dazzle us with their special effects, or they make us happy because the kids defeat the evil wizard in the end, or because even though I'm a boring professor, I can somehow relate to the protagonist's struggle to decide whether or not they really want to become a supervillain, right? We don't actually need to have any critical thoughts while we're watching a movie. We just enjoy them. They don't challenge us, they don't critique the problems in our society, or if they do it in a completely superficial way. And for Adorno, that should make us really terrified. He puts it pretty succinctly on page 69 of the essay. He says, every film is a preview of the next, which promises yet again to unite the same heroic couple under the same exotic sun. And anyone arriving late cannot tell whether he's watching the trailer or the real thing. Right? That, for Adorno, is the culture industry at its most diabolical, because it's also the culture industry at its most ordinary. It makes us want to stop thinking and just keep watching. And for his part, Adorno wants us to wake up and start thinking more critically about what we are seeing. He wants us to recognize what the culture industry is doing to us when we're not thinking critically enough about the ways films really work in our society and in our lives. And it's interesting, like, I've been teaching Adorno in college classes for a really long time, and one of the things I've noticed over the years is that students always seem to want to find the exception, or the little like glimmers of hope that could save film from the withering critiques that Adorno levels at it. And usually these objections go along the lines of like, well, what about indie films, right? What about really creative or artistic passion projects made by independent filmmakers? What about my favorite content creator who rejects some specific aspect of the platform they use? What I find so interesting about these critiques of Adorno, or these questions that people ask about Adorno, is that, like, I think Adorno would mostly just respond by saying all of our questions, all of our attempts to find the light, to find that little glimmer of hope, just shows us how deeply the culture industry has its claws in us, right? Like, I understand where people are coming from when they want to try to defend movies, and don't get me wrong, I love watching movies. I'm a professor of film. I love thinking about this stuff, but I suspect Adorno at least would say it's very revealing that our first response to this provocation, to this critique of this medium, is to try to defend movies rather than recognizing that we might be complicit in our own oppression and manipulation by the culture industry, because that's a much scarier thing to recognize. Right? Let's face it, if we think one content creator on a platform is more authentic than another, that means you've already been watching a lot of stuff on that platform, such that you've developed like expertise in the way that creators think they should or shouldn't behave on that platform. So all you've proven, really, Adorno would say, is that you're so deep into that platform that you can't imagine a way out of it. Right, if you're the person who really actually likes going to art galleries and seeing provocative uses of film as a medium, you've probably also already seen The Lion King, right? So those glimmers of hope that we might like to find, I think Adorno would suggest actually just reveal how deeply embedded we all are in the culture industry and its products. We really can't imagine our lives without it. What we try to do instead is highlight the exceptions rather than the rule to make ourselves feel better about the way the system works. Ultimately, I think Adorno would probably say we rush to the defense of movies because the culture industry has already won the biggest battle that it can win. It has convinced us that we can't possibly live without movies of some kind or another, and that there's good ones out there that we just need to find, and that we're really free while we're living in the consumerist cages that our capitalist society has created for us. So, I realize that's a bit of a cliffhanger, but that's where I want to leave it for this video. I think the best thing to do with Adorno is just to chew on it. Chew on this essay, read it and reread it if you can. Think along with him. And like I said at the beginning, I think my biggest hope for this discussion is just that you'll have a desire to think more critically about movies and religion from here on out, because we're just getting started. So that's all for this video. Have a good day. Go do good things.